A king with no mercy. Alessia DeSantis had never believed in love, not in their world. But when her father was murdered, when she was forced into a marriage that felt more like a life sentence, she realized something brutal. This was not a wedding. This was a cage. Marcello Ricci watched her in silence, then finally smiled. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I'm exactly the kind of monster you need." Chapter 1. The shattered remains of yesterday. The scent of lilies, an impending doom, hung heavy in the air. Alessia DeSantis stared at her reflection, a stranger staring back from the antique Venetian mirror. The ivory silk of the gown felt like a shroud, the intricate lace a web meant to trap her. She was 58, but today, she felt ancient, a relic from a time when duty meant everything and personal happiness meant nothing at all. Her dark hair, streaked with silver that she refused to hide, was piled high in an elaborate coiffure, secured with pearl-studded pins that felt like tiny daggers against her scalp. Her eyes, usually a vibrant, defiant hazel, were dull, reflecting the storm brewing not just outside the palazzo windows, but within her very soul. The storm, a violent squall that had swept in from the Adriatic, mirrored the tempest in her heart. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows, depicting scenes of ancient Roman gods, their stone faces impassive to the human drama unfolding below. The palazzo, a grand, decaying beauty on the Grand Canal, had been in the DeSantis family for centuries. It had witnessed births, deaths, celebrations, and betrayals. Today, it would witness another form of betrayal, a forced marriage, a union built not on love, but on blood and obligation. Her father, Don Giovanni DeSantis, was dead, murdered. A bullet to the head, delivered with the cold precision of a professional hit. The official story was a robbery gone wrong, but Alessia knew better. Her father had enemies, powerful ones. He'd ruled his empire with an iron fist, but in the end, even iron could be broken. The whispers in the hushed hallways of the palazzo spoke of the Ricci family, their longtime rivals, their claws finally sinking deep enough to draw fatal blood. The knock on the door was soft, hesitant. It was Sophia, her lifelong companion and confidant, her face etched with a worry that mirrored Alessia's own. "Signora," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They are waiting." Alessia closed her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. "Waiting to see me chained," she corrected, her voice a low, husky murmur. She turned from the mirror, her gaze sweeping over Sophia's familiar, comforting presence. Sophia, a woman of stout build and unwavering loyalty, had been with the DeSantis family since before Alessia was born. She was more than a servant, she was family, in the truest sense of the word. "It doesn't have to be this way," Sophia said, her eyes pleading. "There are other options." Alessia shook her head. The other options were even more terrifying. Running meant living in constant fear, always looking over her shoulder. It meant abandoning everything she knew, everyone she loved, however few remained. And it meant leaving her father's legacy, his empire, to crumble into dust. She couldn't do that. She wouldn't. "No," Alessia said, her voice firming with a resolve she didn't quite feel. "This is my duty. My father, he would have wanted this." She wasn't sure if that was true, but it was the lie she needed to tell herself to get through the day, to get through the ceremony, to get through the rest of her life. The ceremony was a blur of somber faces, hushed prayers, and the cloying scent of incense. The ancient church, tucked away in a quiet corner of Venice, felt more like a mausoleum. Marcello Ricci, her soon-to-be husband, stood at the altar, a figure of imposing power and unsettling calm. He was a decade younger than her, his dark hair untouched by gray, his face a mask of sculpted perfection, hiding whatever emotions churned beneath. His eyes, the color of dark, polished obsidian, met hers across the expanse of the church, and a shiver ran down her spine. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was a magnetism to him, a dangerous allure that both repelled and intrigued her. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. A single, ruby-encrusted ring glinted on his left hand, a symbol of the Ricci family's power and wealth. Alessia knew that ring. She'd seen it on her father's hand many times, during tense meetings and uneasy truces. Now it was a symbol of her own subjugation. The priest's words washed over her, a meaningless drone of Latin phrases and ancient vows. She felt detached, as if watching the scene unfold from a distance. She was a puppet, her strings pulled by the invisible hands of tradition and obligation. When the time came for her to speak, her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough. "I do." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Marcello's hand, surprisingly warm, closed around hers. His grip was firm, possessive. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, satisfaction, perhaps, or something darker, something she couldn't quite decipher. He repeated his vows, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the church. The kiss, when it came, was not a gentle, loving gesture. It was a claim, a branding. His lips were firm, demanding, and Alessia felt a surge of defiance, a spark of the fire that had been simmering beneath the surface of her grief and resignation. She didn't pull away, but she didn't respond either. She remained passive, a statue carved from ice. The reception was held in the Palazzo's grand ballroom, a cavernous space filled with the hushed whispers of the assembled guests. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, fine wine, and the underlying tension that always permeated gatherings of this kind. These weren't friends and family, they were players in a dangerous game, their smiles masking hidden agendas and long-standing grudges. Alessia moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences and congratulations with a polite nod, her face an impassive mask. She felt Marcello's presence behind her, a constant, watchful shadow. He didn't speak much, but his eyes followed her every move. She found a moment of respite on a small balcony overlooking the Grand Canal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean, the stars glittering like scattered diamonds. The city lights shimmered on the water, creating a scene of breathtaking beauty. But Alessia felt no peace. She felt trapped, suffocated. A hand touched her arm, and she turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Marcello. He stood close, too close, his body heat radiating towards her. The scent of his cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something darker, something untamed, filled her senses. "You are quiet, wife," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. Alessia met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "What is there to say?" she replied, her voice cool and distant. "We are strangers, bound by a vow neither of us wanted." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Unwanted? Perhaps. But necessary. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with a single finger, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I'm exactly the kind of monster you need." His words, though veiled in a strange sort of tenderness, hit her with the force of the storm that had raged earlier. What did he mean? What game was he playing? And why did his touch, despite her fear, ignite a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in years? Something akin to desire? The question hung heavy and unanswered in the night air, leaving Alessia with a chilling premonition of the life and the man she was now bound to. Chapter 2. A Cage of Gilded Promises. The first week of Alessia's married life was a study in controlled silence and veiled observation. The Palazzo Ricci, even grander and more imposing than her own family home, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully crafted prison. Every corridor, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to whisper tales of power, betrayal, and long-held secrets. Every servant, though impeccably polite, moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a household ruled by fear and unwavering obedience. Marcello, her husband, remained an enigma. He was a ghost in his own home, appearing and disappearing at will, his movements as silent and unpredictable as a panther's. He treated her with a chilling courtesy, a formality that was more unsettling than outright hostility. He addressed her as Signora, never by her first name, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Yet, there were moments, fleeting and unexpected, when she saw a flicker of something else in his gaze, a hint of vulnerability, a shadow of pain, quickly masked by his usual impassivity. Their meals were taken in the vast, echoing dining room, a table long enough to seat 30 people, yet often occupied only by the two of them. The silence was broken only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain and the hushed inquiries of the serving staff. Alessia picked at her food, her appetite gone, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice. One evening, after a particularly strange dinner, Marcello surprised her by suggesting a walk in the Palazzo's gardens. The gardens, a sprawling oasis of manicured lawns, sculpted hedges, and hidden fountains, were a stark contrast to the somber interior of the house. The air was cool and fragrant, the scent of jasmine and roses mingling with the salty tang of the nearby lagoon. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Alessia kept a careful distance, acutely aware of Marcello's presence beside her. He was a predator, she reminded herself, and she was his prey. "Tell me about your father," Marcello said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Alessia stiffened. She wasn't sure if he was genuinely interested or simply probing for weaknesses. "He was a strong man," she replied cautiously. "He built his empire from nothing. And he made enemies along the way," Marcello added, his tone matter-of-fact. Alessia glanced at him, her eyes narrowed. "Everyone in our world makes enemies." Marcello nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. "True. But your father was particularly adept at it." He paused, then added, "He was also a man of honor. In his own way." Alessia felt a surge of anger. "What do you know about honor?" she challenged, her voice trembling slightly. "Your family," she stopped, biting back the accusation that was on the tip of her tongue. She couldn't accuse him of her father's murder, not without proof. And even if she had proof, what could she do? She was trapped, bound to him by a vow she hadn't chosen. Marcello stopped walking and turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. "My family has done things I am not proud of," he admitted, his voice low and surprisingly sincere. "But I am not my father. I am not my ancestors." Alessia searched his face, trying to discern the truth behind his words. Was he being genuine, or was this another layer of his carefully constructed facade? She didn't know. She couldn't trust him. And yet, she couldn't deny the flicker of hope that his words ignited within her. "Why did you marry me?" she asked, the question finally escaping her lips. It was a question that had been haunting her since the moment she'd been forced to say "I do." Marcello's gaze held hers, unwavering. "Because you needed protection," he replied simply. "And because I wanted you." The second part of his answer caught her off guard. "Wanted me?" she repeated, her voice a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "You barely know me." He took a step closer, his body heat radiating towards her. "I know enough," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "I know you are strong. I know you are intelligent. And I know you are beautiful." His words, and the way he looked at her, sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a shiver of fear, but something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Desire. A dangerous, forbidden desire for the man who held her captive. She forced herself to look away, to break the spell of his gaze. "This is a marriage of convenience," she reminded him, her voice trembling slightly. "Nothing more." He reached out and gently cupped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes again. "Perhaps," he said, his voice a low, seductive whisper, "but even convenience can have its pleasures." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her body. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to pull away, to resist, but a part of her, a part she'd thought long dead, yearned for his touch, for his kiss. But just as their lips were about to meet, a distant shout shattered the stillness of the night. Marcello pulled back instantly, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. He listened for a moment, then turned to Alessia, his expression grim. Stay here, he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. Do not move. He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alessia alone in the darkness, her heart racing, her mind filled with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling anticipation. The gilded cage had just revealed its bars, and Alessia realized that the promises of this marriage were far more complex and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. What had Marcello been about to do? What had he truly meant? Chapter 3. The Monster in Silk and Shadow. The shout had been followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass, then silence. Alessia, despite Marcello's command, couldn't stay put. Fear for her own safety warred with a nascent, confusing concern for the man who was both her husband and her captor. She cautiously moved in the direction Marcello had disappeared, the manicured garden paths now feeling menacing in the darkness. She found him in the Palazzo's library, a grand room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the scent of old leather and paper. The large French doors leading to the garden were shattered, shards of glass littering the polished marble floor. Marcello stood in the center of the room, his back to her, his body tense. He was speaking in rapid Italian, his voice low and urgent, to someone on his phone. Alessia couldn't understand everything he was saying, but she caught snippets of phrases: security breach, perimeter check, find them. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a random act of vandalism, it was something more, something connected to the dangerous world Marcello inhabited, the world that had claimed her father's life. He ended the call and turned, his eyes dark and stormy. He hadn't noticed her yet, and for a moment, she saw him unguarded, his carefully constructed mask of composure slipped. He looked weary and surprisingly vulnerable. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his jaw clenched tight. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that betrayed his inner turmoil. Then he saw her. His expression instantly hardened, his eyes narrowing. I told you to stay put, he said, his voice sharp with annoyance. What happened? Alessia asked, ignoring his rebuke. Who was that? He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with, he replied evasively. Nothing? Alessia challenged, her voice rising slightly. There's broken glass everywhere, you're talking about security breaches. This is my home now, too, Marcello. I have a right to know what's going on. He sighed, rubbing his temples with his fingers. It was a message, he said finally, his voice grim. From someone who doesn't approve of our union. Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. She knew exactly who he was talking about: the rivals, the enemies, the ones who had likely orchestrated her father's murder. The Rossi family? She whispered, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. Marcello nodded, his expression confirming her worst fears. They're testing me, he said. Testing us. Testing us? By breaking into our home? Alessia's voice was laced with disbelief and a growing sense of dread. It's a warning, Marcello explained, his voice low and dangerous. They want to see how I'll react. They want to see if I'm weak. And are you? Alessia asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Marcello's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something that looked like pride. No, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. I am not weak, and I will not let them touch you. His words, and the intensity with which he spoke them, sent a strange warmth through her. It was a confusing, unsettling feeling. She shouldn't feel safe with him, she shouldn't trust him, and yet, in that moment, she did. He was a monster, she reminded herself, a creature of darkness and violence. But he was her monster, and he was offering her his protection. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, his dark eyes searching hers. You are my wife. Alessia, he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. And I will protect what is mine. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. It was a gesture of tenderness, unexpected and unsettling, coming from a man who exuded such a powerful aura of danger. I don't need your protection, Alessia said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her attempt to sound defiant. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yes, you do, he contradicted softly. You just don't know it yet. He turned away, his gaze sweeping over the shattered glass and the disordered room. Clean this up, he ordered, his voice reverting to its usual tone of command. He was speaking to an unseen servant, his words sharp and precise. Then, he looked back at Alessia, his expression softening slightly. Go to bed, Signora, he said. I will deal with this. Alessia hesitated, wanting to ask more questions, wanting to understand the complex web of alliances and rivalries that had ensnared her. But she knew it was futile. He wouldn't tell her anything more, not now. She was an outsider, a pawn in his game, and he would only reveal what he deemed necessary. She nodded, her head held high, refusing to show him her fear. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the shattered remnants of his library. As she climbed the grand staircase to their bedroom, a room she still felt like an intruder in, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just glimpsed the true nature of the man she had married. He was a monster, yes, but he was also a protector, a man of contradictions, a man who, despite everything, had awakened something within her, something she thought long dead. The silk and shadow of his persona were more intertwined than she'd realized, and the monster was, in his own twisted way, starting to feel like a shield. But against whom? And for how long? The unanswered questions swirled like the broken glass, sharp and threatening. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Palazzo Walls. The following days settled into an uneasy routine. The broken French doors were replaced, the shattered glass swept away, and the palazzo returned to its usual state of immaculate order. But the underlying tension remained, a silent hum beneath the surface of everyday life. Alessia found herself constantly on edge, her senses heightened, listening for any sign of another intrusion, another threat. She spent much of her time exploring the vast palazzo, trying to make it feel less like a prison and more like a home. She discovered hidden courtyards, filled with fragrant flowers and the gentle murmur of fountains. She wandered through the dusty, neglected library, running her fingers over the spines of ancient books, their titles whispering tales of long-forgotten lives. She found a small, sun-drenched conservatory, filled with exotic plants, a haven of peace and tranquility in the heart of the imposing mansion. But even in these moments of solitude, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The servants, though always polite and deferential, seemed to observe her every move, their eyes following her with a quiet intensity that made her skin crawl. She knew they were loyal to Marcello, not to her. She was an outsider, a stranger in their midst, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were constantly reporting back to him, relaying her every action, her every word. Marcello remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He was often gone for hours, attending to his business, a word that encompassed a world of darkness and danger that Alessia was only beginning to understand. When he was home, he treated her with the same chilling courtesy, a formality that was both frustrating and strangely intriguing. One afternoon, Alessia found herself in the Palazzo's archives, a vast, dimly lit room filled with rows of ancient documents detailing the history of the Ricci family. She was searching for something, anything, that might shed some light on Marcello, on his family, on the dangerous world she had been thrust into. She pulled out a dusty ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was a record of financial transactions, dating back centuries. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the faded ink, trying to decipher the cryptic entries. She found names she recognized, names that had been whispered in hushed tones in her own family's Palazzo Rossi, Falcone, Bellini, the families that formed the intricate, dangerous web of the Italian mafia. She discovered records of alliances and betrayals, of blood feuds and secret agreements. She learned of the Ricci family's rise to power, their ruthless ambition, their willingness to do whatever it took to maintain their dominance. She saw a pattern of violence, of intimidation, of cold, calculated cruelty. And then, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a document, dated just a few months before her father's death, detailing a secret meeting between Giovanni DeSantis and Antonio Ricci, Marcello's father. The document was vague, its details obscured by coded language, but the implication was clear. Her father and Marcello's father had been negotiating some kind of deal, a deal that had apparently gone sour. Alessia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Had her father's murder been a result of this failed deal? Had Marcello married her as part of some twisted revenge, some elaborate scheme to consolidate his family's power? She slammed the ledger shut, her hands trembling. She needed to talk to Marcello, to confront him with what she had found. But she knew he wouldn't tell her the truth, not willingly. She needed to find proof, something concrete that she could use to force his hand. As she was leaving the archives, she ran into Isabella, Marcello's younger sister. Isabella, a striking woman in her early 30s, with the same dark hair and piercing eyes as her brother, was a rare presence in the palazzo. She was known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue, and she had a reputation for being fiercely independent, a trait that was unusual in their world. Isabella greeted Alessia with a cool nod, her expression unreadable. "Lost, Signora?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of sarcasm. "Exploring," Alessia replied, trying to sound casual. "Trying to get to know my new home." Isabella raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "This is not a home, Signora," she said, her voice low and serious. "It's a fortress."
"And a prison."
Alessia was taken aback by Isabella's bluntness. "Is that how you see it?" she asked. Isabella shrugged. "It's how it is," she replied. "My brother, he is not an easy man to live with." Alessia hesitated, then decided to take a risk. "Do you know anything about his business?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Isabella's eyes narrowed, her expression turning guarded. "I know enough," she said. "Enough to stay out of it." "But you know about the families," Alessia pressed, her voice barely a whisper. "The Rossi family." Isabella's gaze held hers, unwavering. "The Rossi family are vipers," she said, her voice cold and hard. "They are our enemies. They always have been, and they always will be." "And my father, was he involved with them?" Alessia asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Isabella hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Your father was a player," she said. "He walked a dangerous path. He made deals with the devil." Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. Isabella's words confirmed her worst fears. Her father had been caught in a web of his own making, and she was now paying the price. "And Marcello?" Alessia began, but Isabella cut her off. "My brother is different," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "He is trying to change things." Alessia was skeptical. "Change things?
"How?"
Isabella gave a slight smile, a flicker of something that looked like hope.
"He has his own way," she said.
"A way that is not always pretty, but he is trying to protect what is his. Including you." Isabella's words, echoing Marcello's own, left Alessia even more confused. Was it possible that Marcello was genuinely trying to protect her? Or was this all part of some elaborate deception? The whispers in the palazzo walls seemed to offer conflicting answers, leaving Alessia to navigate a treacherous path between truth and lies, her own heart caught in the crossfire. The walls held secrets, but Isabella held a key, and Alessia sensed that unlocking that door could change everything. But was she ready for what she might find? Chapter 5. The Dance of Defiance and Desire. The conversation with Isabella, though cryptic, had stirred something within Alessia. She found herself watching Marcello with a renewed intensity, trying to decipher the truth behind his carefully constructed facade. Was he the ruthless monster everyone believed him to be, or was there something more, something hidden beneath the layers of power and control? She began to challenge him, subtly at first, testing his boundaries, pushing against the invisible walls of their arranged marriage. She refused to be the passive, obedient wife he expected. She questioned his decisions, his absences, his guarded silences. She demanded to be treated with respect, not as a possession, but as an equal. Marcello, to her surprise, didn't react with anger or violence. He met her defiance with a curious mixture of amusement and admiration. He seemed to enjoy their verbal sparring, their subtle battles of will. He answered her questions, evasively at times, but always with a hint of respect, a recognition of her intelligence and her strength. One evening, after a tense dinner, during which Alessia had openly questioned his dealings with a rival family, Marcello followed her to the conservatory, her sanctuary within the palazzo. He found her standing by the fountain, her back to him, her shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. He approached her silently, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and ferns. He stood behind her for a moment, breathing in the fragrant air, the scent of jasmine and orchids mingling with the earthy smell of damp soil. "You are troubled, Signora," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. Alessia turned, her eyes meeting his. "I am tired," she admitted, her voice weary. "Tired of the secrets, the lies, the constant fear." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "This life, it is not easy," he said. "It takes its toll." "And you, how do you bear it?" Alessia asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then gave a slight shrug. "I have my ways," he replied evasively. "I find solace where I can." Alessia searched his face, trying to read the emotions hidden behind his dark eyes. "And do you find solace with me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He took a step closer, his body heat radiating towards her. "You challenge me, Alessia," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "You make me think. You make me feel." His words, and the way he looked at her, sent a wave of heat through her body. It was a dangerous heat, a forbidden desire, but she couldn't deny it. She was drawn to him, to his power, to his darkness, to the vulnerability she sometimes glimpsed beneath his mask of control. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the ruthlessness she knew he was capable of. "I did not expect to find this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "With you." Alessia didn't know what this was, but she felt it too. It was a connection, a spark, a magnetic pull that defied logic and reason. It was a dance of defiance and desire, a dangerous game played between two people trapped in a world of violence and betrayal. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her body. This time she didn't pull away. She met his kiss, hesitantly at first, then with a growing passion that surprised even herself. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, his body pressed against hers. She felt the strength of his embrace, the warmth of his skin, the scent of his cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something darker, something untamed. She felt a sense of surrender, a letting go of the fear and the anger that had been consuming her. But even in this moment of intimacy, she couldn't completely forget the reality of their situation. She was his wife, but she was also his prisoner. He was her protector, but he was also her captor. Their love, if it could even be called that, was a forbidden flower blooming in a field of blood and violence. She pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't release her. He held her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers. "Is it?" he asked, his voice a low, seductive whisper. "Or is it the only thing that feels right?" He kissed her again, more deeply this time, his lips demanding, possessive. She responded, her body betraying her mind, her desire overcoming her fear. She knew it was a dangerous game, a dance on the edge of a precipice, but she couldn't stop herself. She was falling into the darkness of his embrace, into the forbidden depths of her own desires. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. Marcello pulled back, a flicker of regret crossing his face. He straightened, his usual mask of control slipping back into place. "We must be careful, Alessia," he said, his voice regaining its usual coolness, though a trace of huskiness remained. "Our enemies watch. They will use any weakness, any attachment against us." His words, a stark reminder of their reality, brought Alessia back to earth with a jolt. The warmth of the moment dissipated, replaced by the chilling awareness of their precarious situation. She nodded, understanding, though a part of her rebelled against the cold logic. The dance was intoxicating, but the music was played by unseen forces, forces that could crush them both without a second thought. And yet, she knew she would dance again. The pull was too strong, the desire too fierce. She was playing with fire, and the burn, for now, felt exquisitely, dangerously alive. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Surface. The stolen moments of intimacy between Alessia and Marcello became more frequent, more intense. They were like oases in the desert of their arranged marriage, brief respites from the tension and the danger that surrounded them. But they were always fleeting, always overshadowed by the reality of their situation. Alessia found herself increasingly drawn to Marcello, despite her better judgment. She saw glimpses of the man beneath the mask, the man Isabella had hinted at, the man who was trying to change things in his own way. She saw his intelligence, his sharp wit, his surprising gentleness. She saw his vulnerability, his pain, the scars he carried beneath the surface. One evening, they were sitting in the conservatory, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating their faces. They were talking not about business or families or enemies, but about their childhoods, their dreams, their regrets. Marcello spoke of his father, a cold, distant man who had ruled his family and his empire with an iron fist. He spoke of his mother, a beautiful, fragile woman who had died young, leaving him alone in a world of violence and betrayal. He spoke of his own struggles, his attempts to break free from the cycle of violence, to forge a different path. "I never wanted this life," he confessed, his voice low and filled with a pain that resonated with Alessia. "I wanted something else. Something more." Alessia listened, her heart aching for him. She saw the boy he had been, the boy who had been robbed of his innocence, forced to grow up too quickly, to carry the weight of his family's legacy on his young shoulders. "What did you want?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. He hesitated, then gave a slight smile, a flicker of something that looked like hope. "I wanted to be an architect," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to build things, not destroy them." Alessia was surprised. She had never imagined him as anything other than the ruthless, powerful man he presented to the world. "You still can," she said, her voice filled with a conviction she didn't quite feel. He shook his head. "It's too late," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I am trapped. Just like you." Alessia reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His hand was warm and strong, his grip surprisingly gentle. "We are trapped together," she said, her voice firm. Perhaps we can find a way out. Together." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. He didn't speak, but she saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a glimmer of hope, a spark of desire, a recognition of the bond that was growing between them. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of a longing for something more, something beyond the confines of their arranged marriage, beyond the violence and the betrayal. It was a kiss that promised a future that might be possible if they were brave enough to fight for it. But later that night, Alessia discovered a secret that shattered the fragile illusion of their newfound intimacy. She had woken from a restless sleep, her mind filled with troubling dreams. She had gone to Marcello's study, hoping to find him, to talk to him, to seek comfort in his arms. The study was empty, but a single lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Alessia noticed a small, antique box on Marcello's desk, a box she had never seen before. Curiosity overcoming her, she opened it. Inside, she found a collection of photographs, old and faded, of a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was beautiful, with long, dark hair and laughing eyes. She looked happy, carefree, a stark contrast to the somber portraits that lined the palazzo walls. Alessia picked up one of the photographs, her heart pounding in her chest. On the back, in faded ink, was a single word, amore.
Love.
Alessia felt a sharp pang of jealousy, a feeling she hadn't expected. Who was this woman? And why did Marcello keep her photographs hidden away? She continued to search through the box, her fingers trembling. She found a letter, written in the same woman's handwriting. It was a love letter, filled with passion and longing, addressed to Marcello. Alessia's heart sank. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that this woman had been Marcello's lover, a woman he had loved deeply, a woman he had lost. The discovery changed everything. It shattered the fragile illusion of their intimacy, the hope that they might be able to build something real, something lasting. It reminded her that she was a replacement, a substitute for a woman he could never have, a woman who had held his heart long before Alessia had entered his life. The physical scars were easy to see, but this hidden emotional scar was a chasm, a reminder that she might be sharing his bed, but never his whole heart. Was this the true source of his distant demeanor, the root of his silences? The weight of the past, she realized, was heavier than she'd imagined. And the question now was, could their fragile bond survive the truth, or would it be crushed beneath the weight of a love that had come before? Chapter 7. Echoes of a Father's Legacy. The discovery of the photographs and the love letter cast a long shadow over Alessia's relationship with Marcello. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in the shadow of another woman, a woman who had held his heart in a way she never could. She became withdrawn, distant, her brief moments of defiance replaced by a quiet resignation. Marcello noticed the change in her, but he didn't press her. He respected her silences, her need for space. He seemed to understand, perhaps better than she did, the complex emotions that were swirling within her. One afternoon, Alessia found herself in her father's old study, a room she had avoided since his death. The room was filled with his belongings, his books, his papers, his scent, a lingering reminder of the man she had lost. She felt a wave of grief wash over her, a grief that was mixed with anger and resentment. She sat at his desk, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn surface of the wood. She opened a drawer, filled with his personal effects, his watch, his pen, his cufflinks, a small, silver locket. She picked up the locket, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen it before. She opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside, she found 2 miniature portraits, one of her mother and one of herself as a young girl. Alessia felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had always believed that her father had been a cold, distant man, a man who had cared more about his business than his family. But this locket, this small, hidden token of his affection, told a different story. She closed the locket, holding it tight in her hand. She realized that she had never really known her father, just as she was only beginning to know Marcello. She had judged them both, based on their outward appearances, on the roles they had been forced to play in the dangerous world they inhabited. She began to search through her father's papers, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed some light on his life, on his choices, on his death. She found documents detailing his business dealings, his alliances, his rivalries. She found letters, some from her mother, others from his mistress. Alessia felt a pang of betrayal, a feeling she had experienced before, with Marcello. But this time it was different. She realized that her father, like Marcello, had been a complex man, a man of contradictions, a man who had loved and lost, a man who had made mistakes. She found a letter, dated just a few weeks before his death, addressed to Marcello. It was a letter of apology, a plea for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to make amends for a past betrayal. Alessia's blood ran cold. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that her father had been involved in something that had put his life in danger, something that had led to his murder. And Marcello had known. She confronted him that evening, her voice trembling with anger and accusation. She showed him the letter, the photographs, the locket. She demanded answers, the truth, no matter how painful. Marcello listened, his expression unreadable. He didn't deny anything. He confirmed her suspicions, her fears. He told her the story of his father's betrayal, of his own quest for revenge, of the complex web of alliances and rivalries that had led to her father's death. He told her that he had married her, not out of love, but out of obligation, a way to settle the score, to consolidate his power, to protect his family. But he also told her that he had grown to care for her, to respect her, to desire her. "I never meant to hurt you, Alessia," he said, his voice low and filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "I never meant to fall for you." Alessia didn't know what to believe. She was torn between her anger and her love. Was it possible to love a man who had betrayed her, a man who had used her, a man who was responsible, indirectly, for her father's death? She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the vulnerability. She saw the man beneath the mask, the man who was struggling to break free from the cycle of violence, to forge a different path. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His hand was warm and strong, his grip surprisingly gentle. "We will figure it out," he said, his voice firm. "Together." His words, echoing those he had spoken before, offered a glimmer of hope, a spark of possibility. But the echoes of her father's legacy, the weight of the past, still hung heavy in the air. Could they truly overcome the sins of their fathers, the betrayals, the secrets, the lies? Or were they doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, trapped in a cycle of violence and revenge? The answer, she knew, lay not in the past, but in the choices they made now in the present. The question was not whether she could forgive him, but whether she could forgive herself, and whether she could trust him enough to take a leap of faith, a leap into an uncertain future. Chapter 8. The Serpent's Kiss of Betrayal. The uneasy truce between Alessia and Marcello was shattered by a sudden, violent act. A bomb, planted in Marcello's car, exploded outside the palazzo, narrowly missing him but killing 2 of his bodyguards. The attack was a clear message from the Rossi family, a declaration of war. Alessia was shaken, terrified, but also strangely relieved. Marcello was alive. The thought of losing him, despite everything, filled her with a dread she couldn't ignore. She realized, in that moment of crisis, that her feelings for him had deepened, had transformed into something more than desire, more than respect. She loved him, despite his flaws, despite his past, despite the dangerous world he inhabited. Marcello, though shaken, was outwardly calm, his focus shifting to retaliation, to protecting his family, to protecting Alessia. He moved her to a secure location, a secluded villa in the countryside, a place where he believed she would be safe. But Alessia refused to be hidden away, to be treated like a fragile object. She demanded to be involved, to be informed, to be a part of his world, no matter how dangerous. She had a right to know, a right to fight, a right to defend herself. Marcello, initially reluctant, finally agreed. He recognized her strength, her resilience, her determination. He saw in her partner, an ally, someone he could trust, someone he could rely on. He began to share his plans, his strategies, his secrets. He revealed the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that define the mafia world. He showed her the hidden passages, the secret rooms, the escape routes within the palazzo. He taught her how to use a gun, how to defend herself, how to survive. Alessia, initially hesitant, embraced her new role. She learned quickly, her instincts sharp, her determination unwavering. She discovered a strength within herself she never knew she possessed. She was no longer the passive, obedient wife, the pawn in someone else's game. She was a warrior, a fighter, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to protect herself, to protect Marcello, to protect their future. But the closer she got to Marcello, the closer she got to the truth, the more she realized that the betrayal she had feared was far more complex, far more devastating than she had imagined. She discovered, through a series of coded messages and hidden documents, that the attack on Marcello's car had not been orchestrated by the Rossi family, but by someone within his own ranks, someone he trusted, someone he considered family. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't believe it. Who would betray Marcello? Who would want him dead? She began to investigate, secretly, cautiously, her every move watched, her every action scrutinized. She uncovered a trail of lies, of deceit, of hidden agendas. She discovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Ricci family, a plot to overthrow Marcello, to seize control of his empire. And then, she found the evidence, the proof, the smoking gun. It was a photograph, hidden in a secret compartment in Marcello's study, a photograph of Isabella, his sister, meeting with Lorenzo Rossi, the head of the Rossi family. Alessia's heart sank. Isabella, the woman who had warned her about the Rossi family, the woman who had claimed to be on Marcello's side, was the traitor. She had been playing a double game, manipulating them both, orchestrating the attacks, plotting Marcello's downfall. Alessia was devastated. She had trusted Isabella, had confided in her, had considered her a friend. She felt betrayed, not only by Isabella, but by her own judgment, her own naivete. She knew she had to tell Marcello, but she hesitated. How could she tell him that his own sister, the woman he loved and trusted, was his enemy? How could she break his heart? She decided to confront Isabella first, to give her a chance to explain, to confess, to redeem herself. She arranged a meeting, a secret rendezvous in the Palazzo Gardens, the place where they had first confided in each other. Isabella arrived, her expression unreadable. She greeted Alessia with a cool nod, her eyes betraying no hint of guilt, no sign of remorse. Alessia showed her the photograph, the evidence of her betrayal. Isabella didn't deny it. She admitted everything, her voice cold and hard, her eyes filled with a chilling indifference. "He is weak," Isabella said, her voice dripping with disdain. "He is soft. He is not fit to lead. I am." Alessia was stunned by Isabella's ruthlessness, her ambition, her complete lack of empathy. She realized that Isabella was not the woman she thought she was. She was a serpent, a viper, a creature of darkness and deceit. "You will pay for this," Alessia said, her voice trembling with anger and betrayal. Isabella laughed, a cold, mocking laugh that sent a shiver down Alessia's spine. "You are nothing," she said, her voice laced with contempt. "You are a pawn, a tool, a means to an end. You are expendable." Isabella pulled out a gun, a small, silver pistol, and pointed it at Alessia. The serpent's kiss was about to become a serpent strike. The betrayal was complete, the lines drawn. And Alessia, facing the cold steel of her sister-in-law's weapon, knew that the fight for survival had just become brutally, terrifyingly personal. The whispers had become screams, and the echoes of the past were drowned out by the imminent threat of the present. Chapter 9. A glimmer of unexpected light. Before Isabella could pull the trigger, a shot rang out. But it wasn't Isabella's gun. Isabella gasped, her eyes widening in surprise and pain, the silver pistol clattering to the ground. She crumpled, a crimson stain blooming on her silk dress. Alessia, stunned, looked up to see Marcello standing at the entrance to the garden, a smoking gun in his hand. His face was a mask of fury and grief. He had shot his own sister, to save Alessia's life. He rushed to Isabella's side, kneeling beside her, his hands trembling. He spoke to her in rapid Italian, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. Isabella, her face pale, her breathing shallow, whispered something in response, her eyes locked on Marcello's. Then, she closed her eyes, her body going limp. Marcello remained kneeling, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. He was mourning his sister, the woman he had loved and trusted, the woman who had betrayed him. Alessia approached him cautiously, her heart aching for him. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm, offering a silent gesture of comfort. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. I had to," he said, his voice hoarse, his throat choked with emotion. "She would have killed you." Alessia nodded, her own eyes filled with tears. She knew he had done the right thing, the only thing he could have done. But it didn't make it any easier. The next few days were a blur of activity. The police were called, an investigation was launched, the truth of Isabella's betrayal was revealed. The Ricci family was thrown into chaos, their secrets exposed, their power threatened. Marcello, despite his grief, remained strong, resolute. He dealt with the fallout, the accusations, the recriminations, with a calm efficiency that both impressed and frightened Alessia. He was a man of steel, forged in the fires of betrayal and violence. But in the quiet moments, when they were alone, Alessia saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. She saw his pain, his grief, his guilt. She saw the man beneath the mask, the man who had been betrayed by his own sister, the man who had been forced to kill the woman he loved. She held him, comforted him, offered him her strength, her love, her unwavering support. She was his rock, his anchor, his safe harbor in the storm. One evening, they were sitting on the balcony of their villa, overlooking the rolling hills of the Tuscan countryside. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. Marcello turned to Alessia, his eyes searching hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and filled with gratitude. "For saving my life. For being here."
Alessia smiled. A sad, tender smile.
"You saved my life too," she said. "More than once." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His hand was warm and strong, his grip surprisingly gentle. "I love you, Alessia," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "I know I don't deserve you, but I love you." Alessia's heart swelled with emotion. She had waited so long to hear those words, to know that his feelings for her were real, that they were not just a product of their arranged marriage, of their shared danger. "I love you too, Marcello," she replied, her voice filled with a love that was both fierce and fragile. Despite everything, he leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had survived betrayal, violence, and loss. It was a kiss that promised a future they would build together, a future free from the shadows of the past. As they held each other, watching the last rays of the sun disappear below the horizon, a glimmer of unexpected light emerged from the darkness. It was the light of hope, of healing, of forgiveness. It was the light of a love that had been tested, tried, and ultimately strengthened by the fires of adversity. The serpent's kiss had been deadly, but it had also, paradoxically, paved the way for a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to redefine their lives, and to forge a love that was truly their own. But even in the serenity, Alessia knew, the shadows were never far away. The question remained, would their love be strong enough to withstand the inevitable storms to come? Chapter 10. The Weight of Unspoken Truths. The aftermath of Isabella's death and the subsequent revelations about her treachery left a heavy pall over the Ricci household. While the immediate threat was neutralized, the intricate web of mafia politics meant that the repercussions were far from over. Marcello, burdened by grief and the weight of his responsibilities, became even more withdrawn, throwing himself into the intricacies of damage control and ensuring the family's stability. Alessia, while understanding his need to focus, felt a growing distance between them. The shared intimacy, the glimmer of hope they had found in the Tuscan countryside, seemed to fade as they returned to the imposing palazzo in Venice. The unspoken truths, the secrets that still lingered between them, created an invisible barrier, a wall that Alessia struggled to break down. She knew Marcello was dealing with the fallout from Isabella's betrayal, not just on a political level, but on a deeply personal one. He had killed his own sister to save Alessia, and that act, however justified, had left an indelible scar on his soul. Alessia tried to reach out to him, to offer comfort and support, but he often met her efforts with a stoic silence, a carefully constructed mask of control that hid his inner turmoil. One evening, Alessia found Marcello in his study, poring over documents, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of a desk lamp. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, his jaw clenched tight. She approached him cautiously, her heart aching for him. "Marcello," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper.
"You need to rest."
He didn't look up, his focus remaining on the papers before him. "I can't," he replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "There's too much to do." Alessia placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. You're pushing yourself too hard, she said. You need to grieve. You need to process what happened. He finally looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. There's no time for grief, he said, his voice hoarse. The wolves are at the door, Alessia. They're waiting for me to falter, to show weakness. But you're not weak, Alessia insisted, her voice filled with conviction. You're the strongest man I know. But even the strongest men need to feel. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that betrayed his inner turmoil. Feeling is a luxury I can't afford, he said. Not in this world. But you're not alone, Alessia reminded him, her voice pleading. I'm here. I'm with you. Let me help you. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be considering her words, weighing them against the heavy burden of his responsibilities. I don't know how, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. It was the first crack in his armor, the first glimpse of vulnerability she had seen since Isabella's death. Alessia took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His hand was cold, his grip surprisingly weak. Just talk to me, she said, her voice soft and gentle. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me anything. He hesitated, then took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with a growing fluency, his words pouring out like a dam that had finally broken. He spoke of his guilt, his grief, his anger. He spoke of his love for Isabella, his betrayal, his pain. He spoke of his fear, his uncertainty, his doubts. He spoke of the weight of his family's legacy, the burden of his responsibilities, the constant pressure to maintain control, to show strength, to never falter. Alessia listened, her heart aching for him. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer solutions. She simply listened. She offered him her presence, her understanding, her unwavering support. As he spoke, the tension in his body seemed to ease, his shoulders relaxing, his jaw unclenched. The mask of control he had worn for so long began to crumble, revealing the raw, vulnerable man beneath. When he finally fell silent, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. Thank you, he said, his voice husky with emotion. For listening. For understanding. Alessia smiled, a tender, loving smile. Always, she replied, her voice filled with a love that was both fierce and unwavering. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of a deeper connection, a stronger bond, a love that had been forged in the crucible of pain and loss. It was a kiss that acknowledged the unspoken truths, the shared grief, the mutual understanding. The weight of those truths remained, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable barrier. It was a shared burden, a challenge they would face together, a testament to the strength of their love, a love that was slowly, painfully, but surely, healing the wounds of the past. But Alessia knew, even in this moment of shared vulnerability, that the world outside the palazzo walls remained unchanged. The threats were still real, the enemies still lurked, and the unspoken truths extended beyond Isabella's betrayal. There were other secrets, other shadows, that still lingered, waiting to be revealed. The question was, would their newly strengthened bond be enough to withstand the next storm? Chapter 11. Masks of Civility and Malice. The relative calm that followed Isabella's death was shattered by an invitation to summons, really to a gathering hosted by Don Carlo Bellini, one of the most powerful and influential figures in the Italian underworld. The event was ostensibly a celebration, a birthday party for Bellini's eldest son, but everyone knew it was a power play, a chance for the various families to assess each other's strengths and weaknesses, to forge alliances, and to plot betrayals. Marcello was reluctant to attend, knowing that it was a trap, a potential minefield of hidden agendas and dangerous rivalries. But he also knew that he couldn't refuse. To decline the invitation would be seen as a sign of weakness, an admission of defeat. He had to attend, to show his strength, to prove that he was still in control, despite the recent turmoil within his family. Alessia, despite her initial apprehension, insisted on accompanying him. She refused to be left behind, to be hidden away like a fragile object. She was his wife, his partner, his ally, and she would stand by his side, no matter the danger. The Bellini estate was a sprawling, opulent villa on the outskirts of Rome, a fortress disguised as a palace. The grounds were teeming with guests, members of the various mafia families, their faces masks of civility and malice, their smiles hiding daggers, their words laced with veiled threats. Alessia, dressed in an elegant gown of deep emerald green, felt a chill run down her spine as they entered the grand ballroom. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere charged with an undercurrent of violence. She felt the eyes of the assembled guests upon her, assessing her, judging her, trying to determine her worth, her loyalty, her vulnerability. Marcello, his arm protectively around Alessia's waist, guided her through the crowd, his movements smooth and confident, his expression a mask of impassive control. He greeted the other dons, the heads of the various families, with a respectful nod, his words carefully chosen, his tone measured. Don Carlo Bellini, a short, stout man with a cruel smile and piercing eyes, approached them, his gaze lingering on Alessia with an unsettling intensity. He greeted Marcello with a perfunctory handshake, then turned his attention to Alessia, his eyes raking over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Ah, Signora Ricci," Bellini said, his voice oily and insinuating. "You are even more beautiful than the rumors suggest."
Marcello is a lucky man.
Alessia met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Thank you, Don Bellini," she replied, her voice cool and distant. "But I assure you, my husband's luck has nothing to do with my appearance." Bellini chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Alessia's spine. "Perhaps," he said, his eyes still fixed on her. "But beauty can be a powerful weapon, Signora, especially in our world." Marcello stepped forward, his body shielding Alessia from Bellini's gaze. "My wife is not a weapon, Don Bellini," he said, his voice sharp and warning. "She is my partner, my equal, and I suggest you treat her with the respect she deserves." Bellini's smile widened, but his eyes narrowed, betraying his anger. "Of course, Don Ricci," he said, his tone mocking. "I would not dream of disrespecting your partner." He turned and walked away, leaving Alessia and Marcello standing alone in the center of the room. Alessia felt a surge of relief, but also a growing sense of dread. Bellini's words, his gaze, his attitude, had been a clear threat, a warning that they were walking on dangerous ground. As the evening progressed, Alessia noticed that several of the other dons were watching her, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She realized that she was being tested, scrutinized, assessed. They were trying to determine her loyalty, her strength, her usefulness. They were trying to decide whether she was an asset or a liability to Marcello. She also noticed that Marcello was being unusually attentive to her, his hand constantly on her arm, her waist, her back. He was protective, possessive, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd, watching for any sign of threat, any hint of danger. She understood his concern, his need to protect her, but she also felt a growing sense of frustration. She was not a child. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a strong, capable woman, and she could handle herself. She pulled away from his grasp. He turned to her, surprised and perhaps a bit offended. "I'm not a piece of property, Marcello," she hissed under her breath. "Stop hovering." He stared at her wordlessly. "I will not be treated like one of your possessions." She made air quotes and continued. "I need some air."
"There are rumors," she said.
Whispers. That Marcello is not as strong as he appears. That he is vulnerable. Vulnerable?
"How?"
Alessia pressed, her heart pounding in her chest. Juliana looked around, making sure they were not being observed. "There are those who believe he is too soft," she said. "That he is too influenced by you." Alessia felt a surge of anger, mixed with fear. "They think I'm a weakness?" she challenged. Juliana nodded. "They see your independence, your defiance, as a threat. They believe you are weakening him, making him less ruthless." "And what do you believe?" Alessia asked, her gaze fixed on Juliana's.
Juliana smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
I believe you are his strength, she said. But strength can be perceived as weakness in this world. Be careful, Alessia. Be very careful. Juliana placed a hand on Alessia's arm, a gesture of solidarity, of warning. Then, she turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Alessia alone with her thoughts, her fears, her suspicions. Alessia returned to the ballroom, her mind racing. She saw Marcello across the room, talking to Don Falcone, Juliana's husband. She watched them, her eyes narrowed, trying to decipher their conversation, trying to read their expressions. She saw Falcone place a hand on Marcello's shoulder, a gesture that seemed too familiar, too friendly. She saw Marcello nod, his expression grim, his body tense. She approached them cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she heard Falcone say, in a low voice, "You must be careful, Marcello. Your enemies are circling." And your wife, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Alessia was a liability, a target, a weakness. Marcello saw Alessia approaching, and his expression changed instantly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and warning. He excused himself from Falcone and took Alessia's arm, guiding her away from the crowd. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I heard what Falcone said," Alessia replied, her voice trembling slightly. "About me." Marcello's grip on her arm tightened.
"Don't listen to him," he said.
"He's trying to sow discord. But is it true?" Alessia pressed, her eyes searching his.
"Do they see me as a weakness?"
Marcello hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Some of them do," he admitted. "But they're wrong. You are my strength, Alessia. My only strength." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He kissed her, a fierce, possessive kiss that spoke of his love, his fear, his determination to protect her. But even in his embrace, Alessia couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of impending danger. Juliana's words, Falcone's warning, the watchful eyes of the other dons, it all pointed to a conspiracy, a plot, a betrayal that was brewing beneath the surface of civility and malice. The threads of loyalty and deceit were intertwined, and Alessia knew that she and Marcello were caught in a web that was tightening around them, threatening to strangle them both. The question now was, who was pulling the strings, and could they unravel the web before it was too late? Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom's Song. The Bellini gathering had planted a seed of doubt in Alessia's mind, a suspicion that grew with each passing day. Marcello's reassurances, his displays of affection, felt insufficient, somehow. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, that there were still secrets between them, unspoken truths that threatened to tear them apart. She began to observe him more closely, watching his interactions with others, scrutinizing his every move, listening for any hint of deception. She found herself questioning his motives, his decisions, his loyalties. One evening, she overheard a phone conversation between Marcello and an unknown caller. He spoke in rapid Italian, his voice low and urgent, his words guarded. She couldn't understand everything he was saying, but she caught snippets of phrases: the Rossi family, payment, agreement, silence. Her blood ran cold. What was he talking about? What agreement? What payment? Was he still dealing with the Rossi family, despite everything? She confronted him later that night, her voice trembling with anger and accusation. "Who were you talking to?" she demanded. "What were you discussing?" Marcello looked at her, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, then gave a slight shrug. "It was business," he replied evasively. "Business?" Alessia challenged, her voice rising. "What kind of business? Were you talking to the Rossi family?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that betrayed his inner turmoil. "Alessia, you need to trust me," he said. "I'm doing what I have to do to protect us." "Protect us?" Alessia scoffed. "By making deals with our enemies? By keeping secrets from me?" "There are things you don't understand," he said, his voice low and serious. "Things you don't need to know. I have a right to know." Alessia insisted, her voice filled with frustration and pain. I'm your wife, your partner. We're supposed to be in this together. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and sadness. This life, it's not that simple, he said. There are complexities, nuances, things that are difficult to explain. Try me, Alessia challenged, her gaze fixed on his. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. He began to speak, slowly, carefully, choosing his words with caution. He told her about the ongoing negotiations with the Rossi family, the delicate balance of power, the constant threat of violence. He explained that he was trying to maintain a fragile peace, to prevent another war, to protect his family, to protect her. He admitted that he had made certain concessions, agreements, payments, to ensure the Rossi family's cooperation, their silence. He insisted that it was all for the greater good, for the long-term stability of their world. Alessia listened, her heart aching, her mind reeling. She understood his reasoning, his logic, but she couldn't accept it. She couldn't condone his actions, his compromises, his willingness to deal with the very people who had murdered her father, who had tried to kill him. How can you do this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. How can you betray everything we stand for? He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. I'm not betraying anything, he said. I'm doing what I have to do to survive, to protect what is mine. And what am I? Alessia asked, her voice trembling. Am I just something to be protected? A pawn in your game? He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His hand was warm and strong, but his grip felt desperate. You are everything to me, Alessia, he said, his voice a husky murmur. You are my love, my life, my reason for everything. But his words, though heartfelt, didn't erase the doubt, the suspicion, the growing sense of betrayal. She pulled her hand away, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Marcello, she said, her voice breaking. He looked at her, his expression devastated. Alessia, please, he began, but she cut him off. I need time, she said. I need space. I need to think. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the silence of their bedroom. She went to the conservatory, her sanctuary, the place where she had once found solace in his arms. But now, even this place felt tainted, filled with the ghosts of their broken promises, their shattered trust. She needed freedom to discover her own person. As she stood there, surrounded by the fragrant flowers and the gentle murmur of the fountain, she realized that she had a choice to make. She could stay, trapped in a gilded cage, a prisoner of her love for a man she could no longer trust. Or she could leave, walk away, seek her own freedom, forge her own path, even if it meant facing the dangers of their world alone. The price of freedom was high, but the cost of staying might be even higher. The song of independence, a melody she had almost forgotten, played in her heart, a counterpoint to the dirge of their failing marriage. And Alessia knew, with a chilling certainty, that she had to make a decision that would change her life forever. The weight of his world was crushing her spirit, and she had to find a way to breathe again, even if it meant shattering the fragile remains of their love. Chapter 14. Blood on the Cobblestones. Alessia's decision to leave, to seek her own freedom, was not made lightly. It was a wrenching, agonizing choice, born out of a deep sense of betrayal and a growing realization that she could no longer live in Marcello's world, a world of secrets, lies, and constant danger. She spent several days in a state of quiet turmoil, wrestling with her emotions, weighing her options, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. She knew that leaving Marcello would be the hardest thing she had ever done, but she also knew that it was necessary for her own survival, for her own sanity. She packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, leaving behind the jewels, the gowns, the symbols of her gilded cage. She wrote a letter to Marcello, a farewell note, explaining her reasons, expressing her love, but also her pain, her disappointment, her disillusionment. She planned to leave in the dead of night, while Marcello was away on one of his mysterious business trips. She had arranged for a car, a driver, someone she trusted, someone who would take her to a safe place, a place where she could start anew, rebuild her life, find her own path. But her plans were shattered by a sudden, violent turn of events. As she was preparing to leave, she heard a commotion outside the palazzo, shouts, screams, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw chaos in the courtyard below, men fighting, bodies falling, blood staining the ancient cobblestones. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that the palazzo was under attack. The Rossi family, despite Marcello's efforts, had decided to make their move, to eliminate him, to seize control of his empire. Alessia knew that she had to escape, to get out of the palazzo before it was too late. But she also knew that she couldn't leave Marcello. Not like this. Not without knowing if he was alive or dead. She grabbed a small pistol, the one Marcello had taught her to use, and cautiously made her way downstairs, her senses heightened, her every move calculated. She moved through the shadows, avoiding the fighting, her heart racing, her mind focused on survival. She found Marcello in the main hall, fighting for his life. He was surrounded by Rossi men, outnumbered, outgunned, but still fighting with a fierce determination, a desperate courage. Alessia saw one of the Rossi men raise his gun, aiming at Marcello's back. Without hesitation, she raised her own pistol and fired. The man crumpled to the ground, his shot going wild. Marcello turned, his eyes widening in surprise, then relief. He saw Alessia, her pistol still raised, her face a mask of determination and fear. "Alessia," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get out of here. It's not safe." "I'm not leaving you," Alessia replied, her voice firm. "We're in this together." They fought side by side, back to back, protecting each other, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other unwavering, despite everything. They were a team, a force to be reckoned with, their love for each other fueling their courage, their determination. They managed to fight their way out of the palazzo, escaping into the narrow, winding streets of Venice, the sounds of gunfire and screams fading behind them. They ran, hand in hand, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding in unison. They found refuge in a small, hidden church, a sanctuary, a place where they could catch their breath, tend to their wounds, assess their situation. Marcello, his face bruised and bloodied, his clothes torn, looked at Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. Again. Alessia smiled, a tired, shaky smile. "We saved each other," she replied. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was gentle, tender, his eyes filled with a love that was deeper, stronger, more profound than anything she had ever known. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are not a weakness. You are my strength, my courage, my everything." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, passionate kiss that spoke of a love that had been tested, tried, and ultimately triumphant. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their unwavering loyalty to each other. The blood on the cobblestones was a testament to the violence of their world, but it was also a symbol of their resilience, their courage, their unwavering love. They had survived, together, and they would face the future, together, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Alessia's planned departure was forgotten, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose, a shared determination to fight for their love, for their lives, for their freedom. But even in this moment of shared victory, Alessia knew that the war was far from over. The Rossi family would not give up so easily, and the threats, both external and internal, still loomed. The question now was, would their love be enough to overcome the darkness, or would they be consumed by the flames of their enemies' hatred? Chapter 15. A haven in the heart of darkness. The small church, tucked away in a quiet corner of Venice, provided a temporary sanctuary, a brief respite from the violence and chaos that had engulfed their lives. Alessia and Marcello tended to their wounds, both physical and emotional, their shared ordeal forging an even stronger bond between them. Marcello, despite his injuries, was already planning their next move, his mind focused on retaliating against the Rossi family, on securing their safety, on reclaiming his power. He contacted his loyal men, giving orders, gathering information, plotting his revenge. Alessia, while understanding his need for action, urged him to be cautious, to think strategically, to avoid further bloodshed. She reminded him that they were not just fighting for their survival, but for their future, a future that she hoped would be free from violence, from fear, from the constant threat of betrayal. They spent several days in the church, hiding from their enemies, planning their next move, rediscovering their love for each other. They talked, they shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They made love, their passion fueled by their shared ordeal, their renewed commitment to each other. Marcello revealed more about his past, his upbringing, his struggles with his father's legacy. He spoke of his desire to change things, to break the cycle of violence, to create a different kind of life for themselves, for their future children. Alessia, in turn, shared her own dreams, her aspirations, her longing for a normal life, a life free from fear, from secrets, from the constant threat of death. She spoke of her desire to use her intelligence, her skills, her strength to help others, to make a difference in the world, to create something positive, something lasting. They realized that they shared a common vision, a shared goal, a desire for a different kind of life, a life that was not defined by their family's past, by the violence and betrayal that had shaped their world. They decided to leave Venice, to seek refuge in a place where they could be safe, where they could start anew, where they could build a new life for themselves, a life based on love, trust, and mutual respect. Marcello had a contact, a trusted ally, in a small, remote village in the Italian Alps, a place where he believed they could be hidden, protected, forgotten. He arranged for transportation, a secret journey, a dangerous escape from the clutches of their enemies. They left the church in the dead of night, disguised as ordinary travelers, their faces hidden, their identities concealed. They traveled by boat, by car, by foot, through back alleys, across hidden bridges, over treacherous mountain passes. They finally arrived at their destination, a small, picturesque village nestled in the heart of the Alps, a haven of peace and tranquility, a world away from the violence and chaos of Venice. The village was isolated, self-sufficient, its inhabitants simple, hard-working people who lived off the land, who valued their privacy, who respected their traditions. Marcello's contact, an old friend of his father's, welcomed them with open arms, offering them shelter, protection, anonymity. He provided them with a small, rustic cottage, a place where they could live in peace, where they could start anew, where they could build a new life for themselves. Alessia and Marcello settled into their new life, embracing the simplicity, the tranquility, the beauty of their surroundings. They worked the land, they tended to the animals, they helped their neighbors, they became part of the community. They shed their old identities, their old lives, their old burdens. They were no longer Don Marcello Ricci and Signora Alessia DeSantis, the powerful mafia couple, the targets of their enemies. They were simply Marco and Anna, a young couple in love, seeking a peaceful life, a fresh start. But even in this haven, in the heart of darkness, they could not completely escape their past. The memories, the scars, the threats, still lingered, casting a shadow over their newfound happiness. They knew that their enemies would not forget them, would not forgive them, would not stop searching for them. The question now was, could they build a strong enough foundation, a secure enough sanctuary, to withstand the inevitable storm that would eventually reach them, even in this remote corner of the world? Or would their past, like a relentless tide, eventually catch up to them, dragging them back into the darkness they were so desperately trying to escape? Chapter 16. The Unraveling of Secrets. Life in the mountain village brought a semblance of peace to Alessia and Marcello. They embraced their new identities, Marco and Anna, finding solace in the simplicity of their daily routines. Alessia discovered a hidden talent for gardening, nurturing the small plot of land behind their cottage, coaxing life from the earth. Marcello, surprisingly, found a sense of fulfillment in working with his hands, helping the villagers with repairs, construction, and other tasks that required his strength and ingenuity. But beneath the surface of their idyllic existence, the past continued to haunt them. Alessia, despite her efforts to focus on the present, couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of impending danger. She knew that their enemies, particularly the Rossi family, would not give up their quest for revenge. She also suspected that there were still secrets, unspoken truths, that lingered between her and Marcello, threatening to unravel the fragile fabric of their newfound happiness. One day, while exploring the attic of their cottage, Alessia stumbled upon a hidden box, tucked away in a dark corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. Curiosity overcoming her, she opened it. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, photographs, and documents, all related to Marcello's family, to his father's past, to the intricate web of mafia alliances and rivalries. She began to read the letters, her heart pounding in her chest. They were written by Marcello's father, Don Antonio Ricci, to various individuals, revealing details of his business dealings, his betrayals, his ruthless ambition. She found letters to Don Carlo Bellini, confirming their long-standing alliance, their shared plots, their mutual disdain for the DeSantis family. And then, she found a letter, dated just a few months before her own father's death, a letter that made her blood run cold. It was a letter from Don Antonio Ricci to Lorenzo Rossi, the head of the Rossi family. In the letter, Don Antonio outlined a plan, a conspiracy, to eliminate Giovanni DeSantis, to seize control of his empire, to divide the spoils between the Ricci and Rossi families. Alessia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The letter confirmed her worst fears, her deepest suspicions. Marcello's father had been directly involved in her own father's murder, had orchestrated the plot, had betrayed his supposed friend and ally. But what was even more shocking was the postscript, a handwritten note added to the bottom of the letter. Marcello knows. He is with us. Alessia's hands trembled as she read those words. Marcello knew. He had known all along. He had known about his father's involvement in her father's death. He had known about the conspiracy. He had been a part of it. She felt a surge of betrayal, of anger, of pain that was almost unbearable. She had trusted him. She had loved him. She had believed in him, and he had lied to her, deceived her, manipulated her. She confronted Marcello that evening, her voice shaking with rage and heartbreak. She showed him the letter, the evidence of his betrayal, the proof of his lies. Marcello looked at the letter, his face paling, his eyes widening in shock and fear. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Alessia, I can explain, he stammered, his voice hoarse. Explain? Alessia cried, her voice filled with anguish. How can you explain this? You knew. You knew all along. You lied to me. You betrayed me. He reached out to her, but she recoiled, her body trembling with fury. Don't touch me, she said, her voice cold and hard. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with a growing desperation, his words pouring out like a confession. He told her that he had discovered his father's plot shortly before Giovanni DeSantis' death, that he had tried to stop it, to warn her father, but it had been too late. He claimed that he had been forced to go along with his father's plan, to protect his family, to protect himself. He insisted that he had never wanted to hurt Alessia, that he had fallen in love with her despite everything, that he had tried to protect her from the truth, to shield her from the pain. I did it for you, Alessia, he pleaded, his eyes filled with tears. I did it all for you. But Alessia couldn't believe him, not anymore. The trust was broken, the bond shattered, the love poisoned by his lies, his betrayal. The unraveling of secrets had revealed a truth she couldn't ignore, a truth that changed everything. The haven they had found was now a prison of deceit, and Alessia knew that she could no longer stay, that she could no longer live with a man who had kept such a devastating secret from her. The idyllic life they had built was a facade, and the foundation, built on lies, had crumbled beneath her feet. The question now was, could she forgive him? Could she ever trust him again? Or was the damage too great, The betrayal too profound? Chapter 17. Reckoning with the past. Alessia's world shattered around her with the revelation of Marcello's complicity in his father's plot. The idyllic life they had built in the mountains, the love they had rekindled, all seemed like a cruel illusion, a fragile dream shattered by the harsh reality of his deception. She fled the cottage, unable to bear being in the same room with him, the man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her so deeply. She ran through the village, her heart pounding, her tears blurring her vision, the cold mountain air stinging her face. She found refuge in a small, ancient chapel, its stone walls offering a semblance of solace, a place to gather her thoughts, to confront her pain. She spent hours in the chapel, wrestling with her emotions, her anger, her grief, her sense of betrayal. She questioned everything, her past, her present, her future. She wondered if she had ever truly known Marcello, if the man she had fallen in love with had ever existed, or if he had been a carefully constructed facade, a mask designed to deceive her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the chapel floor, Alessia made a decision. She could not stay in the village. She could not continue living a lie. She could not forgive Marcello. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But she also knew that she could not simply run away, that she could not escape her past, that she had to confront it, to reckon with it, to find a way to move forward, to find her own peace. She returned to the cottage, her heart heavy, her resolve firm. Marcello was waiting for her, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Alessia," he began, his voice hoarse. "Please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Alessia interrupted, her voice cold and distant. "I know the truth. And I know what I have to do." "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm leaving," Alessia said, her voice firm. "I'm going back to Venice. I'm going to finish what my father started." Marcello's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I'm going to take back what is rightfully mine," Alessia said. "I'm going to reclaim my family's legacy. I'm going to fight." "Alessia, that's too dangerous," Marcello protested, his voice filled with concern. "The Rossi family, they'll kill you." "I'm not afraid of them," Alessia replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not afraid of anyone. Anymore." But what about us?" Marcello asked, his voice pleading. "What about our love?" Alessia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pity. "There's no us," she said. "Not anymore. You broke that. You broke my trust. You broke my heart." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone, defeated, his dreams shattered, his love lost. Alessia left the village the next morning, her heart heavy, but her spirit unbroken. She traveled back to Venice, a city of shadows and secrets, a place where she had once been a prisoner, a pawn in a dangerous game. But now, she was returning as a warrior, a fighter, a woman determined to reclaim her past, to avenge her father, to forge her own future. She contacted Sophia, her lifelong companion and confidant, the woman who had been with her through thick and thin, the woman she trusted implicitly. Sophia, though surprised and concerned by Alessia's return, welcomed her with open arms, offering her support, her loyalty, her unwavering friendship. Alessia began to gather information, to reconnect with her father's allies, to assess the situation, to plan her next move. She discovered that the DeSantis family, though weakened by her father's death and her own absence, was still a force to be reckoned with. There were still loyal men, loyal families, who were willing to fight for her, to help her reclaim her rightful place. She also discovered that the Rossi family, emboldened by their recent victories, had become even more ruthless, more powerful, more dangerous. They had consolidated their control over the city, their influence reaching into every corner of the underworld. Alessia knew that she was facing a formidable enemy, a powerful force that would stop at nothing to destroy her. But she was not afraid. She had faced betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, and she had emerged stronger, more determined, more resilient. She was ready to fight. She was ready to reclaim her legacy. She was ready to face her past, to reckon with her demons, to forge her own future, a future free from the shadows of deceit, a future where she could finally find peace, justice, and perhaps even love. But first, she had to confront Marcelo's past and her own, and decide, once and for all, where her loyalties lay. The reckoning was at hand, and the price, she knew, would be paid in blood. Chapter 18. The Flame of Forbidden Love. Alessia's return to Venice was met with a mixture of shock, fear, and cautious optimism. The DeSantis loyalists, who had been lying low, awaiting a sign of hope, rallied to her side. Sophia, ever the steadfast confidant, provided invaluable support, connecting Alessia with key figures, arranging meetings, and ensuring her safety. Alessia, hardened by her experiences, adopted a pragmatic approach. She knew she couldn't simply charge into battle against the Rossi family. She needed a plan, a strategy, and allies. She began by consolidating the remaining DeSantis assets, assessing their strengths and weaknesses, and identifying potential threats. She also sought out information, delving deeper into the web of alliances and rivalries that define the Venetian underworld. She discovered that Marcello, despite his betrayal, had not been entirely idle. While he had initially collaborated with his father, he had also been subtly working to undermine the Rossi family from within, gathering intelligence, disrupting their operations, and protecting DeSantis' interests wherever possible. He had been playing a dangerous double game, risking his own life to mitigate the damage caused by his father's actions. This revelation gave Alessia pause. While she still couldn't forgive his initial deception, she began to understand the complexity of his situation, the impossible choices he had been forced to make. She realized that his love for her, though tainted by betrayal, had been genuine, and that he had been trying, in his own way, to protect her, even from himself. One evening, Alessia received an anonymous message, a cryptic note delivered by a trusted contact. It was a summons, an invitation to a secret meeting at a location known only to a select few, the Rialto Bridge, at midnight. Alessia, suspicious but also intrigued, decided to attend. She knew it could be a trap, a Rossi ambush, but she also sensed that it might be something else, something unexpected. She arrived at the Rialto Bridge at the appointed hour, the ancient stone structure shrouded in darkness, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the pillars. She waited, her hand on the pistol hidden beneath her cloak, her senses heightened, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing figure that she recognized instantly. Marcello. He approached her cautiously, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Alessia," he said, his voice hoarse. "I had to see you."
Why?
Alessia asked, her voice cold and distant. "To finish what your father started?" "No," he replied, his voice pleading. "To explain. To ask for your forgiveness." "Forgiveness?" Alessia scoffed. "After everything you've done? After everything you've hidden from me?" "I know I don't deserve it," he said. "But I had to try. I had to tell you the truth, the whole truth." He began to speak, his words pouring out like a torrent, a confession of his sins, his regrets, his desperate attempts to atone for his past. He told her that he had discovered his father's plot to kill Giovanni DeSantis only days before the assassination, that he had tried to warn her father, but it had been too late. He had been forced to play along, to protect his family, to protect Alessia from his own father's wrath. He revealed that he had been secretly working against the Rossi family ever since, providing information to the DeSantis loyalists, sabotaging their operations, protecting Alessia from afar. He had been playing a dangerous double game, risking his own life to undo the damage his father had caused. He confessed that his love for her had been the driving force behind his actions, the only thing that had kept him going, the only thing that had given him hope. "I love you, Alessia," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I always have. And I always will." Alessia listened, her heart torn between her anger and her lingering love for him. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to forgive him, but the wounds of his betrayal were still raw, the scars still visible. I don't know if I can trust you, Marcelo, she said, her voice trembling. He reached out to her, but she flinched, stepping back. He lowered his hand, his eyes filled with pain. I understand, he said, but I had to try. I had to tell you the truth. And I had to warn you. Warn me? Alessia asked, her eyes narrowing. About what? The Rossi family, he said. They know you're back. They're planning something. Something big. I'm not afraid of them, Alessia replied, her voice firm. You should be, Marcelo said. They're not just after you. They're after everything. They want to destroy the DeSantis family, once and for all. They won't succeed, Alessia said, her voice filled with determination. They might, Marcelo said. Unless we work together. Alessia looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the desperation, the love. She also saw the fear, the knowledge that they were facing a formidable enemy, an enemy that could destroy them both. Why should I trust you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because I love you, he replied. And because we're stronger together. The flame of forbidden love, rekindled by his confession, flickered in the darkness. Alessia knew that trusting him again was a risk, a gamble, but it was a risk she was willing to take. She had faced betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient. She was not afraid to fight, and she was not afraid to love, even if that love was forbidden, dangerous, and potentially deadly. She nodded. The decision, as impossible as it seemed, was made. They would face the future, together, whatever it may hold. But even as she accepted his offer, a nagging doubt lingered. Was his confession genuine, or another layer of deception? Only time, and the trials to come, would tell. Chapter 19. A choice between two worlds. Alessia's decision to join forces with Marcelo was not made lightly. It was a calculated risk, a desperate gamble, born out of a mixture of love, fear, and a growing realization that she could not face the Rossi family alone. She still harbored doubts, suspicions, lingering resentments, but she also recognized the strength, the intelligence, the resources that Marcelo brought to the table. They began to work together, cautiously at first, their interactions strained by the weight of their past, by the unspoken truths that still lingered between them. They shared information, strategized, planned their next move, their every action shadowed by the threat of betrayal, by the ever-present danger of the Rossi family. Alessia discovered that Marcelo had been more than just a passive observer in his father's machinations. He had actively worked to undermine the Rossi family from within, gathering intelligence, disrupting their operations, and protecting DeSantis' interests whenever possible. He had a network of informants, loyal contacts within the various families who provided him with valuable information, with insights into the Rossi family's plans. Marcelo, in turn, learned about Alessia's growing strength, her determination, her ability to rally the DeSantis loyalists to her side. He saw in her a leader, a fighter, a woman who was not afraid to challenge the established order, to fight for what she believed in. Their shared struggle, their mutual dependence, began to forge a new bond between them, a bond based not just on love, but on respect, trust, and a shared purpose. They were no longer simply lovers, they were partners, allies, comrades in arms. One evening, as they were poring over maps and documents in Alessia's hidden headquarters, a small, unassuming apartment overlooking a quiet canal, Marcelo turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and sadness. You've changed, Alessia, he said, his voice soft. You're not the same woman I married. No, Alessia replied, her voice firm. I'm not. I'm stronger now. More resolute. And more dangerous, Marcelo added, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Alessia smiled back, a tired, knowing smile. Perhaps, she said. But it's a necessary change. To survive in this world, you have to be strong. You have to be ruthless. And what about us? Marcelo asked, his voice hesitant. Is there still room for love in this new world you're creating? Alessia looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his gaze, the vulnerability, the love that still flickered beneath the surface of his guarded exterior. "I don't know, Marcelo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I honestly don't know. There's so much baggage, so much pain, so much betrayal. I don't know if we can ever truly overcome that." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His hand was warm and strong, his grip surprisingly gentle. "We have to try," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We have to fight for it. For us. For our future." Alessia squeezed his hand, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him, but the scars of his past betrayal were still fresh, the wounds still raw. Before she could respond, Sophia burst into the room, her face pale, her eyes filled with alarm. "Alessia," she said, her voice breathless, "we have a problem. The Rossi family, they're making their move." Alessia and Marcelo exchanged a look, their eyes locking in a silent understanding. The time for talk was over. The time for action had come. They learned that the Rossi family, led by Lorenzo Rossi, was planning a full-scale assault on the DeSantis holdings, a coordinated attack designed to wipe them out once and for all. They had gathered their forces, recruited allies, and were preparing to strike that very night. Alessia and Marcelo knew that they had to act quickly, decisively, if they were to have any chance of survival. They rallied their forces, mobilized their allies, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Alessia, despite her initial reluctance, found herself taking charge, issuing orders, coordinating defenses, her natural leadership skills emerging, honed by her recent experiences, by her determination to protect her family, her legacy, her future. Marcelo, impressed by her strength, her courage, her strategic thinking, deferred to her judgment, offering his support, his expertise, his unwavering loyalty. As they prepared for battle, Alessia realized that she was at a crossroads, a turning point in her life. She had a choice to make, a choice between two worlds, the world of her past, the world of violence, betrayal, and constant fear, or the world of her future, a world she could build, a world of peace, justice, and perhaps even love. She knew that the path she chose would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of her family, the fate of Marcelo, the fate of everyone she cared about. The choice was hers and hers alone, and she knew that she had to make it, now, before it was too late. The two worlds were colliding, and Alessia stood at the epicenter, her decision the only thing that could determine which world would prevail. The weight of that choice, the burden of that responsibility, pressed down on her, a heavy cloak of destiny. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The night of the Rossi attack was a maelstrom of violence and chaos. The streets of Venice, usually quiet and serene, echoed with the sounds of gunfire, screams, and the clash of steel. Alessia, leading the DeSantis forces, fought with a fierce determination, a courage born of desperation, and a deep-seated desire for justice. Marcelo, by her side, was a whirlwind of controlled fury, his skills honed by years of experience in the brutal world of the mafia. They fought their way through the narrow streets and canals, pushing back the Rossi attackers, protecting their people, defending their territory. Alessia, despite her initial apprehension, proved to be a natural leader, her strategic mind and unwavering resolve inspiring her troops, turning the tide of the battle. The final confrontation took place in the heart of the DeSantis territory, the old palazzo where Alessia had spent her childhood, the place where her father had been murdered, the place where her life had changed forever. Lorenzo Rossi, a cruel, ruthless man with a thirst for power and revenge, faced Alessia and Marcelo, his eyes burning with hatred, his hands stained with blood. "You cannot win, DeSantis," Rossi sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your family is finished. Your legacy is dust." "My legacy is not dust," Alessia replied, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "My legacy is strength, resilience, justice.
And you will not take that from me."
"You are a fool," Rossi said. "You are weak. You are nothing. I am Alessia DeSantis, Alessia declared, her voice ringing with defiance. "And I am not afraid of you." A fierce battle ensued, a brutal clash of wills and weapons. Alessia and Marcello fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They were a force to be reckoned with, their combined strength and skill overwhelming their enemies. Marcello, driven by his love for Alessia and his desire for redemption, fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He protected Alessia, shielded her from harm, his every action fueled by his unwavering commitment to her. Alessia, in turn, fought with a courage and determination that she never knew she possessed. She faced Rossi, her father's murderer, the man who had caused her so much pain, so much loss. In the end, it was Alessia who delivered the final blow. She disarmed Rossi, her pistol pointed at his heart, her finger on the trigger. She had the chance to kill him, to avenge her father, to end the cycle of violence once and for all. But she hesitated. She looked at Rossi, his face contorted with fear and hatred, and she saw not just a monster, but a man, a broken, defeated man. She saw the futility of revenge, the endless cycle of violence that had consumed her family, her world. She lowered her pistol. "It ends here," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I will not be like you. I will not be defined by hatred. I will choose a different path." Rossi, stunned by her mercy, stared at her in disbelief. He had expected death, revenge, but he had received something else, something he could not comprehend: forgiveness. Marcello, watching Alessia, felt a surge of pride, of admiration, of love. He had never seen such strength, such courage, such compassion. He knew in that moment that he had made the right choice, that he had chosen the right woman, the right path. The remaining Rossi forces, demoralized by their leader's defeat and Alessia's unexpected act of mercy, surrendered. The battle was over. The DeSantis family had survived. Alessia, exhausted but triumphant, stood in the ruins of the old palazzo, the scene of so much pain, so much loss, but also, now, the scene of her victory, her redemption. She had made her choice. She had chosen a different path, a path of peace, of justice, of forgiveness. She had chosen to break the cycle of violence, to build a new world, a better world, for herself, for her family, for her future. Marcello approached her, his eyes filled with love and admiration. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "You did it, Alessia," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved us all." "We did it," Alessia corrected, her voice firm. Together. They stood there, hand in hand, amidst the rubble and the ruins, the remnants of their past, and they looked towards the future, a future filled with uncertainty, but also with hope, with possibility, with the promise of a new beginning. The final confrontation had been not just of forces, but of hearts and loyalties, and Alessia, in choosing mercy over revenge, had finally found her true self, her true path. The question now was, could she and Marcello navigate that path together? Could their love survive the trials they had faced? And could they truly build a new world, free from the shadows of the past? The answer, they knew, lay not in the battles they had won, but in the choices they made, every day moving forward. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Venetian sun, warm and golden, streamed through the windows of the newly rebuilt DeSantis Palazzo, illuminating a scene of peace and prosperity. The palazzo, once a symbol of violence and betrayal, had been transformed into a center of art, culture, and community, a testament to Alessia's vision, her determination to create a better world. Alessia, now 63, her dark hair streaked with more silver, but her hazel eyes still vibrant and full of life, stood on the balcony, overlooking the Grand Canal. She was no longer the grieving daughter, the forced bride, the reluctant warrior. She was a leader, a philanthropist, a woman who had found her purpose, her strength, her voice. She was surrounded by her family, not the family of blood and obligation, but the family she had chosen, the family she had built. Sophia, her loyal companion, was by her side, her wrinkled face beaming with pride and affection. Children laughed and played in the courtyard below, their innocent joy a stark contrast to the violence and chaos of the past. And Marcelo was there, his arm around her waist, his dark eyes filled with a love that had endured, that had deepened, that had been forged in the crucible of their shared struggles. He was no longer the haunted, brooding man she had married, the man trapped by his family's legacy. He was a partner, a lover, a father, a man who had found redemption, forgiveness, and a new purpose in life. He had used his skills, his intelligence, his connections, to help Alessia rebuild the DeSantis empire, not as a mafia enterprise, but as a legitimate business, a force for good in the community. He had become an architect, not of buildings, but of lives, creating opportunities, fostering hope, building a better future. Their children, twins, a boy and a girl, were the embodiment of their love, their resilience, their hope for the future. They were named Giovanni and Isabella, after the family members they had lost, a tribute to the past, but also a promise for the future. Alessia looked at Marcelo, her heart filled with a love that was both profound and enduring. They had been through so much, faced so many challenges, overcome so many obstacles, but they had survived, together. They had found their way back to each other, their love stronger, deeper, more resilient than ever before. "We did it," Marcelo said, his voice soft, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "We built a new world." "Yes," Alessia replied, her voice filled with emotion. "We did." Together, they kissed, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had defied the odds, that had conquered darkness, that had found its way to the light. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their unwavering loyalty to each other, to their family, to their future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, Alessia looked out at the city she loved, the city she had fought for, the city she had rebuilt. She had faced her past, she had reckoned with her demons, she had chosen her own path. She had found peace, justice, and love in the most unexpected of places, in the most unlikely of circumstances. She had transformed the darkness into light, the violence into peace, the betrayal into forgiveness. She had found her freedom, not by escaping her world, but by changing it, by shaping it, by making it her own. And she had done it all with the love and support of the man who had once been her captor, her enemy, and who had ultimately become her savior, her partner, her soulmate. The vow in chains had become a vow of choice, a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering human spirit. The end.